Well, thank you very much, Stephanie and Nature Alberta, for inviting us, Crooked Creek Conservancy, one of your member clubs since 1996, I guess, or one of the old timers, to join you tonight and partnering in this very important presentation. Our blizzard is almost over here. We've had blizzards for 2 days, and so you can't get out on any of the side roads. So I'm glad we're not meeting face to face this time. The last time it was lovely to do that. But anyway, so thank you, Nature Alberta. And I thought the president was Elizabeth Watts, but I guess it's somebody new now. So thanks to them, and particularly to the outreach coordinator, Stephanie Weisenbach. This is the second time we did this, and Nature Alberta has been so helpful with us to do this. Crooked Creek Conservancy is a relatively small conservancy, land trust, natural history club, environmental group, a federal charity as an Eco Gift Canada, so we can hold easements, land easements for private landowners and so on. We haven't been able to do that too much. We've discovered that our pockets aren't very deep and that perpetuity is a long time if you agree to monitor somebody's property. So, but we've done a few, and we really appreciate the opportunity to talk about private land conservation here in rural Alberta. So we are all those things, a land trust and a natural history club, and we do a lot of citizen science. We're getting more and more that way. When we started out 25 years ago, again, quite a few of us were just retiring. A number of us from universities or teaching, and then some of us went into farming as well. But nonetheless, we're a variety of people. And we're getting to be quite a ripe old age now. In fact, quite a number of us have already moved on. And so we're in the process of really trying to attract new members, young members. And because we've run the Christmas bird count here, I have for a number of years, and we help with the butterfly count and so on, we've been, in the last couple of years, very successful in attracting some wonderful new and young biologists. Dr. Schock, who's an amphibian biologist, Monica Dahl, who does the caribou recovery plan for the province, and a couple of other really, really good young people, and plus a lot of more people. So we would welcome, again, we're based in the Athabasca region, but we take that broadly for the Athabasca watershed and bioregion. We have quite a few members from the city. So, if you have any connection with this, or if you just want to join by Zoom, we'd welcome you. And it's $20 a year for a membership, and we give you lots of work to do, and we do quite a bit of citizen science more and more. Some of these new people have introduced us to INAT, to Nature Links, to Wild Tracks, and we're getting more and more into that, and really, really enjoying that sort of thing. I just see one of my presidents here, Rosemary Neves. She's just checked in, Rosemary. And I think Paula Evans may be here as well at some point. We'll say we're a cross section of all kinds of interests and ages, primarily older now, but gradually trying to get those younger demographics. And we're farmers and do all kinds of things, and particularly gardeners. And so we've noticed in the last few years quite a loss of wild bees, bumblebees, and so on. It seems like our numbers are way down. Certainly our Christmas bird counts, the numbers are increasingly down. And about 8 years ago, I started to read about neonicotinoids, and began to read about a couple of scientists across the country, in particular, who were really looking at this and doing the research, doing the science, telling the truth. And one of them was our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Christie Morrissey from the University of Saskatchewan. For the last presentation here, we had also had a entomologist from U of A here, Dr. Jessamine Manson. I understand she's fled to Virginia now. I hope she has lots of bumblebees down there, because she loves her bumblebees, and she reassured us that, in fact, there's still quite a variety of nice bumblebees here. And anyway, I'm sad to hear that she's gone, but I'm sure she's happy down there. What I wanted to say was that this is the second in a row. It took us 7 years in between for me to wake up and realize that it's time to have an update from Dr. Morrissey. I just want to say that the first one we did in December 2015 aptly was named after one of our patron saints, Rachel Carson, and so it's called A Prairie Silent Spring, assessing threats and protecting our prairie bees, birds, invertebrates, wetlands, and agroecosystems. And I'm delighted to, this is almost like Christy 2, you know, Rocky 1 and Rocky 2. Well, this is Christy 2. She's going to give us an update of just a few of the things she's been doing in the last 7 years. I'm sure you'll be delighted with the presentation, as we all were last time. So I'll turn it over now to Stephanie, who's going to give her the real introduction and the sort of the formal introduction of all her many accolades. Stephanie.
Great. Thank you for that information, Harvey, and that great introduction to the introduction. I am just going to post the Crooked Creek Conservancy's website in the chat for everybody to be able to find that wonderful organization, so you can become a member and get involved in all of the wonderful activities and citizen science initiatives going on there. So thank you so much. And thank you for coordinating this presentation and linking us all to our wonderful presenter this evening. So Dr. Christie Morrissey is a professor at the University of Saskatchewan in the Department of Biology. Her research expertise is in avian ecotoxicology, aquatic ecology, ecophysiology, and wildlife conservation. Christy has over 20 years experience working on issues related to environmental contamination from pesticides and other chemicals and the use of birds as indicators of environmental health. She has published over 80 highly cited journal articles and book chapters and was named to the Royal Society College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. She works closely with provincial and national governments on regulatory issues of pesticides, wetlands, and the conservation of migratory birds, and is working on projects to implement nature-based solutions to improve sustainable agricultural production in the prairies. Dr. Morrissey has been featured broadly in the national and international media, including CBC, National Geographic, Nature of Things, The Messenger documentary, and more, for her research on pesticide impacts and conservation of birds, insects, and prairie wetlands. So on behalf of Nature Alberta's entire nature network, welcome, Christy.
Oh, thank you so much. Really nice to see such a big crowd. And thank you, Harvey, for reminding me how many years ago that was. So time just seems to fly, right? And we're all in a bit of a time warp. So that was a great reminder. And I have fond memories of that evening. So that was great. So I'm thrilled to be back. All right, so hopefully my screen is shared and everybody can see that. All right, so we'll get started. Thanks so much for the introduction. And yeah, I'm delighted to be here to kind of recap some of these, you know, interesting topics around my research and my research team that we've been working on for the past several years in the prairies regarding pesticide threats to birds and aquatic ecosystems and biodiversity. And I'm going to also not only give you sort of the bad news, but I do want to share a lot of the good news and the sort of positive things that we're also researching, and some end on some hopeful notes. I'll start by saying that agriculture and environment actually are this paradox, and a lot of people who are in the agricultural industry don't necessarily see it this way, but certainly increasing productivity, this goal of using modern agriculture to produce more food, has lowered prices, although I realize right now our prices are increasing. But in general, the price of food is low. But at the same time, this kind of modern agriculture is also degrading farmer and human well-being and livelihoods, as well as the environment. And so when we talk about trying to use modern agriculture to sustain a world of 9 billion people, I try to resolve some of this in my head, that this probably is really a paradox that we need to try and solve, that modern agriculture needs to shift in order to sustainably feed a growing population. Of course, changes in agriculture and pesticide reliance has evolved over time. In the 1960s, one farmer was feeding just maybe 25 people, and pesticide use was starting to rise quite rapidly in North America as synthetic chemicals became more widely used. And these were brought to light by people like Rachel Carson, who suddenly woke the world up that these inventions of new chemicals were not all good. By the mid-1980s and 1990s, we actually were using more pesticides than we've ever used in terms of by mass. Some of the leading chemicals were organophosphates that were highly toxic to birds and insects. But farmers now could feed more people. And as we get to sort of modern today and in the last couple of decades, pesticide use really has kind of leveled out, and we are using still very high quantities of agrochemicals over a wider area. And now the leading chemicals that are being used tend to be herbicides that are applied on GMO crops, things like Roundup Ready crops, but also insecticides like the neonicotinoids. So conventional modern agriculture has brought a lot of benefits, but it tends to be highly simplified, single-purpose landscapes. So we're trying to grow a single crop over a massive area, and I think the prairies are kind of highlighting how the focus has been on that approach, to have mechanization, to increase our production through economies of scale. Now, in order to maintain this simplified system, there has to be a lot of inputs. So most of our modern systems are using high amounts of pesticides and fertilizers with the single goal to increase yields. And when we have that singular focus on yields, we tend to forget about all the other metrics, all the potential environmental harms, but also, potentially costly production, right? By increasing the amount of inputs that we need, we also are relying on higher and higher costs. And our lab has been trying to study sort of changes in pesticide use more recently. What's going on in Canada? Well, herbicides are a big feature in most of Canada's agricultural regions, and I mentioned Roundup Ready crops are really driving sort of an increase in use. And you can see in the prairie region here, there's actually been at least a 58% increase in herbicide use over the last 20 to 30 years. And for fungicides, those that are applied to control fungal diseases, we similarly see an increase, particularly in the prairie region, although it's even larger. So it's about a 400% increase in fungicide use since the 1990s. And for insecticides, we see similar pattern again. There's been an increase in use, so darker colors show more use. And conservatively, we estimate about 50% more insecticides are applied in the prairie region today than there was in the 1990s. So the trend is towards more chemical use, and we now have data to kind of support that. All right, so we're going to try a little thing here with a Zoom poll and see if it'll work, but I'm going to launch this poll, and you can use your own computer to go ahead and select this. So which pesticide from this list do you think is the most concern for the environment? So I've given you sort of a list of herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides, and you can decide or take a stab at which one you think is the most problematic for the environment. And if you have no clue, you can choose G there, no clue. All right, we've got about 75% of the people who have answered, and it's quickly going up. And some of these chemical names you may never have heard of. If you're a farmer, though, you probably are very familiar with them.
No.
Or you might be familiar with their trade names. All right. Okay, let's see what everybody said. Hopefully you can see that. Can you see the shared results?
Yep.
Great. All right. So most people said, well, at least 32% of you who had a clue said glyphosate. There was a big proportion, of course, who didn't know, who were you know, I won't say clueless, but didn't know. And but yeah, a large number of you think herbicides like glyphosate are a big problem, and certainly these chemicals, which are used on Roundup ready crops, are a big problem in the sense that they are so widely used now that there's probably no environmental sample that we can go out and take from water or soil that isn't contaminated with glyphosate. And so really this one is a big hitter, no question. In terms of toxicity, it's not the most toxic compound, and there are others on the list, usually insecticides and the fungicides, which are more problematic. But several of you picked out the neonicotinoid imidacloprid, which is an insecticide, as your sort of second pick. But there was a good number that also said DDT. So 11% of people said DDT. And this is interesting because DDT is one of these chemicals that we're all sort of familiar with. And I thought it would be interesting to show you where DDT fits in terms of toxicity for birds. So here's your little toxicology lesson for today. A big number for an LD50 value, that is the concentration that will kill 50% of a test population of songbirds, for DDT is about 1,334 milligrams per kilogram. By comparison, you can see that many other insecticides are much lower values, meaning they are more toxic than DDT. Imidacloprid, which many of you identified, one of the neonicotinoids, is only takes 35 milligrams per kilogram to cause mortality in songbirds. So these are much more toxic than DDT. And yet most people sort of believe DDT was the worst thing we've ever made. In fact, humans are making more and more toxic chemicals all the time. So toxicity is increasing, and as a result, we tend to use less of them, but they actually are, in many cases, an order of magnitude or more toxic to various species out there. All right, so the focus tends to be on some of these kind of problem chemicals like the glyphosates and the neonicotinoids and certain fungicides. We often pick on certain bad actors. And part of the reason we pick on them is because of their toxicity, and part of the reason we pick on them is because of how much is being used. Herbicides on the left panel, herbicides on the left panel here, you can see the most commonly used herbicide is glyphosate. So that is the Roundup chemical that you use in your garden, but also is used widely on all those Roundup ready GMO crops. Glufosinate is the second most commonly used in the prairies. And then you can see some of the other common ones, MCPA and 2,4-D. But there's lots of herbicides out there, and they're often used on single crops. In multiple chemicals are used on single crops, but certainly this glyphosate is a big one. Fungicides have a big list as well. The most common fungicide is prothioconazole. It's an azole fungicide known as an endocrine disruptor, but also, again, highly toxic to a wide range of fungal pathogens, but also is known to amplify or increase the toxicity of insecticides. So it's often used not for its fungal protection, because in many cases, the prairies, for example, are very dry. There's not very many fungal pathogens out there, but these chemicals are used to sort of amplify the toxicity of insecticides that are also used. And if you look at the insecticides, the ones that are used most commonly in the prairies, the ones that are, I guess, the most problematic, tend to be well, at least the top 4 out of 5 are neonicotinoids. Those are the chemicals that, well, Harvey mentioned were, became on people's sort of watch list around about the early 2010, when really sort of research on these chemicals started to take off. And so the reason these ones are so problematic is, and have triggered all kinds of controversy, is because Health Canada has been reviewing those chemicals. Initially, they banned them in 2016, but later, just last year in May 2021, they actually reversed their decision to ban those, the neonicotinoids, and sort of set us all back on our heels wondering what was going on. Now, the reversal of PMRA's, decision on neonicotinoids was quite shocking. The proposed decision in 2016 for imidacloprid and 2018 for the clothianide and the thiamethoxam basically said the environmental risk assessment showed that in aquatic environments in Canada, imidacloprid was being measured at levels that are harmful to aquatic insects. But, and they, recommended all outdoor uses get canceled. But in 2021, they actually changed the language in the report, and it said that risks are largely acceptable with mitigation. So some outdoor uses are not acceptable. Those were largely on turf or some minor use crops. But in general, they said that some mitigation measures like spray buffer zones, rate reductions, and label changes will be enough to mitigate the risk. So there was a big shift in the decision. And this kind of did come as a shock to the community. Some of the, well, at least the research community. Some of the kind of concerns around neonicotinoid insecticides happens to be because they are applied so widely on a wide range of different crop types. They're applied as foliar sprays, they're applied as seed treatments, they're also applied as drenches, soil drenches. But the reason they're problem for the environment is that they are highly water soluble. So they move into wetlands and other surface waters. They move into groundwater very easily, and they're highly persistent in the environment. So the half-life for some of these chemicals can be several years, and that is not something we've seen for most insecticides that are kind of in the modern category. The last chemicals that were really super persistent like that were the DDTs and the other organic chlorines. And they also kill a lot of things pretty handily. So they are targeting pests and other insects, but they're a bit non-discriminant, and they will kill beneficial insects. And there are problems for insectivorous birds as a result that rely on those insects for food, as well as some new research that we've found that they are highly toxic to seed-eating birds. So just to kind of give you a sense, why were these things even registered in the first place? How did the PMRA, the Pest Management Regulatory Agency, which is the arm of Health Canada, ever come to bring these things into use if they are so problematic? Well, that's a good question. I wish I knew the full answer, but I can tell you one of the answers is based on the initial tests for species that were submitted by the registrant, the chemical manufacturer, were done on this little water flea, so the Daphnia magna. And the initial test submissions for this water flea showed that this particular species is uniquely insensitive to neonicotinoids. So the amount or the concentration that it takes to sort of kill or reduce the population of Daphnia by half is in the range of about, well, this is on a scale micrograms per liter, but it's something in the range of about 10,000 to 100,000 micrograms per liter. And instead, if you look at some of these other more sensitive species, like the insect species in this list, these are all their scientific names, but they are way more sensitive, in the range of only about 1 to 100 micrograms per liter will actually cause mortality for this group of insects. And there's also reported sublethal effects on their behavior and emergence and overall patterns of survival. And of course, I don't know about you, but if you've ever seen any swallows or other insectivorous birds, they don't feed a whole lot on kind of water fleas like Daphnia magna. They really are only feeding on these aquatic insects that have a larval life stage in the water but emerge and fly around. And so the problem that we've now seen is that the insect abundance for these beneficial species is being disproportionately affected by these chemicals that get into the surface waters. There's also problems for those seed-eating birds, as I mentioned. So many of the small farmland birds stop on migration, or they spend time foraging in these crop fields. The timing of when farmers are seeding is usually, well, for us around May, right? So the month of May is when most of the seeding happens. And for you who are bird watchers, you know that that's like prime time to be out looking for birds, right? To be watching bird migration. Well, indeed, that's the most risky period for birds to be flying through, landing on farm fields and consuming treated seeds. The treated seeds shown here, which are all colored, these are seed spills that have been naturally found in the environment. These are common occurrences in the prairie region and elsewhere. This picture from the middle is showing a huge pile of treated seeds that was actually dumped next to a wetland in Saskatchewan at one of our study sites. And these pictures on the right show research from the Dakotas, where Charlotte Roy and others have documented seed spills, smaller seed spills, but routinely occurring in the landscape. And when we have looked across the literature about whether birds are exposed to neonicotinoids, we've actually found that there's quite a bit of research now that shows that neonicotinoids are detected in their tissues of both seed-eating as well as non-seed-eating birds. So species that you would expect to eat treated seeds are on the top, but also there's been research done on these kind of non-seed-eating birds, including hummingbirds, and we've also done work on swallows, tree swallows, and found that 100% of the tree swallows that we sample, their blood, all have detectable concentrations of neonicotinoids. So there's increasing evidence that these chemicals are widely distributed in the environment and that birds are affected by them, not just insects, not just the bees. Now there's kind of a sort of research that we've been really kind of heavily working on for the last several years that has tried to understand how toxic are these chemicals to songbirds that would be migrating and just maybe incidentally picking up a treated seed. So they're, maybe mistaking that for food, or they might consume a few treated seeds and then maybe feel sick. How much would it take to cause effects? And we've done research now on 2 species, white-crowned sparrows shown here, and we've also done research on the red-winged blackbird. And in both cases, we found that low doses of consumption, by giving them a single oral dose of these chemicals, causes rapid weight loss and a change in their food consumption. So for example, here in the left panel, this is for red-winged blackbirds, we found that the controls show no change in food consumption and no change in body mass. But once you start to give them a little bit more of the chemical in the low, medium, and high doses, you see a proportionate reduction in food consumption. So 25 or 68% reduction in food consumption, and their body mass also rapidly declines. And this body mass change happens within 6 hours of consuming the treated seed. So this is really fast. They are quickly going off their food and they're quickly losing weight. So they essentially kind of become anorexic. And further research that we've done on the white-crowned sparrow, when we've dosed them in the field with very low concentrations, a single dose, and then we release them with a transmitter, a radio tracking transmitter on their back, shown here with this long whip antenna, and track them using the MODIS wildlife tracking system, where we did this in southern Ontario. We found that the birds that were exposed to those low levels and ultimately high doses, we only had 2 doses, were affected, and the high dose group actually significantly delayed their departure timing. So they were stopping over at a particular site in Ontario where we captured them. After releasing them, they actually delayed their onset of resuming migration by 3.5 days on average, but some of them actually delayed it as much as 10 days compared to the controls. So that reduction in feeding, that loss of body weight, is enough to sort of set the birds back, make them have to sort of wait and stay longer at the stopover site to recover, regain that body mass, and then they potentially can move on to migrate. Of course, all of this assumes that they don't consume a lethal level, that they only consume a low dose. And you might ask, well, how much would it take to actually cause the effects that we're observing, or indeed the effects that might actually lead to death? Well, a white-crowned sparrow here, he weighs about 27 grams, and they can eat something like 230 wheat kernels or over 2,300 canola seeds per day. So a lot. And on migration, that's probably even higher. But the equivalent amount of imidacloprid treated seeds that they would need to eat to cause lethality is shown here. So for corn, it's less than 1 treated seed. For sunflowers, it might be about 3 seeds. For cereals and for canola, we're talking about 34 to 37 seeds. So well within the range of what they normally eat per day. And then to cause the effects that we saw on body mass and their delayed migration, here's how much they would have to eat. For corn, it's 1/10 of a seed. Sunflowers, it's 2/10 of a seed. And then cereals and canola, about 3. So 3 canola seeds or 3 cereal seeds would be enough to delay their migration and cause that rapid body weight loss. Now, it's one thing for us to kind of think, okay, well, why don't we just ban those neonicotinoids, right? Like that's what we were sort of hoping for, I suppose, when PMRA first made their decision. We all kind of celebrated, but I've changed my tune now, and I wasn't all that upset when they said that the ban was being reversed. I kind of wasn't surprised, let's just say. Maybe I was a bit upset, but I wasn't surprised. Because neonics are a big problem, but they aren't the only problem. And in the last few years, we've been trying to understand like where the pesticide contamination is across the whole region and which chemicals are actually contributing to this. And as it turns out, neonics are part of this mix. They're everywhere. But we've done predictive modeling as well as indeed where the black dots are. We've been going out and water sampling and finding that in areas where it's red here, which is a lot of places, right? So you can see in Alberta, there's still quite a lot of red, although in southeastern Saskatchewan and southwestern Manitoba, it's very red. These areas have a high potential for wetland contamination from various pesticides, including the neonicotinoids, but also other chemicals. In fact, some of the chemicals that we detect in those wetlands are shown here. Of course, glyphosate's not on this list, and the reason for it is because it's in every wetland sample that we could analyze for, so we no longer even look for it. It's just there. You have to take my word for it. But these other chemicals are shown pretty much in the same order as what I showed you based on their use patterns. We find 2,4-D, which are herbicides, and MCPA. But we also find the neonicotinoids in blue here. Those are problematic. They're showing up. But look at some of these other new chemicals that are starting to appear pretty frequently. Chlorantraniliprole, cyantriniloprol and flubendiamide. These are the new diamide insecticides that were brought on the market essentially to replace neonics. So the chemical companies have been working on replacement chemicals for some years now, and these new diamides are already primed to soon take over from the neonics. The challenge is that they are no safer in terms of their toxicology profile, in terms of their water solubility, or any other metric that we've looked at. In fact, they are more toxic to aquatic insects than even the imidacloprid, the one they're designed to replace. So there's challenges with all the new chemicals, and if we don't keep our eye on the prize, you know, the chemical companies are one step ahead of the scientists developing new compounds, and by the time we as environmental scientists detect them, they're already in widespread use. So we're trying to get a little bit ahead of this curve now by understanding what's out there. So some of the things that we're trying to do now is think about, well, what is the real crux of the problem? If it's not single chemicals, it's the collective of chemicals. And it looks like for insecticides, there's this association with landscape simplification. So if we look at where the insecticides are used, I'm just showing you a map of Saskatchewan because of course that's where I'm from. And you can see where it's kind of red, you know, we're close to Saskatoon here, but sort of near the middle where there's red or even these orange areas, these have high insecticide use. Okay, so there's high amounts of insecticides being used. And if we compare that to this map of landscape simplification, that is where most of the agricultural land is under crop. You can see there's kind of a pretty good agreement here, just even visually, right? So the areas that are high with insecticide use also seem to have high landscape simplification. So more crop land in this agricultural land means that we've got these very simplified landscapes with very little wetlands, fewer hedgerows or trees or you know, grassy margins, all of that being removed in favor of more cropland. And we actually modeled this, and we found that there is a very strong association between landscape simplification and insecticide use. And at the rate that it's increasing, the rate that landscape simplification is increasing today, if we project that into the next 10 or 20 years, we actually predict there'll be a 10 to 20% increase in insecticide use just based on landscape simplification alone. So while we keep simplifying these lands, while we're using modern techniques that cultivate edge to edge, we're actually also relying more and more on insecticides to maintain those production levels. So I don't think that chemical bans are the solution. PMRA took 9 years from the time they decided to look at neonicotinoids as a problem. From early in 2012, they initiated their special reviews up until 2021, where there was this long sordid history of how to, you know, whether they should or should not ban them. And we've still ended up in exactly the same place 9 years later than we were in 2012, except for we're using more of it today than we were back then. So I don't think that bans are the solution. I also don't know that regulatory systems are actually robust enough for us to rely on those as a measure to protect biodiversity. I think that our reliance on pesticides and inputs is actually a symptom of a much bigger issue, a much wider issue. And I'll just kind of talk a little bit about that. I think all of the sort of symptoms of biodiversity declines that, you know, even Harvey brought up earlier, that you're seeing fewer birds, fewer insects, are coupled with things like surface water and groundwater degradation. You know, algal blooms are increasingly prominent. We see diseases and weeds and insect pests that are really taking over. They're winning. So if we're using more chemicals, we're also, you know, fighting this fight and losing it. There's also, of course, climate extremes, the droughts, the floods that are threatening crop losses. loss of soil fertility, moisture levels. These are hugely problematic for farmers. And production costs just keep going up. So of course we know now we're in a situation with Russia and Ukraine that is going to drive the price of fertilizer and fuel up, which is only going to put further pressure on farmers and their very, very narrow profit margins. So this could cause serious economic issues. So I think the whole issue of insecticide use is sort of just a very small part of the bigger problem. The bigger problem is how we look at agricultural sustainability. To date, we've mostly focused on this yield, right? We need more yield, and that is our single metric. But in doing that, what we're doing is trading off environmental health, and we're trading off environmental health for, with this perceived notion that we need to do that so that farmers can make a living, and that, economics is more important. And I would tend to disagree that this is out of balance, that environmental health doesn't necessarily need to be traded off in order to achieve all three of these things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I think the solutions are there. And in fact, we're starting now to do some of this work to study, to actually do the science on what the solutions are. And the solution, in my opinion, is that we need to have agriculture work with biodiversity. So let me talk a little bit about that. Biodiversity is good for agriculture. It can do a job. And in fact, we know now that pollinators and other beneficial insects are hugely important for production. And to date, there's been little emphasis, at least in North America, on trying to boost biodiversity for the purpose of production. But in places like the UK, they're starting to catch on to this. So there was a study done in the UK where they took 3 or 8% of the marginal land out of production, planted it with diverse perennials like you see here in the picture, and those areas can now provide habitat for those beneficial insects, which is a form of natural capital. It turns out that when they studied this, they actually found that the business as usual had lower yields compared to the conversion of 3 or 8% of that land, that marginal land. So the profits were bigger on the sites which had taken land out of production, the most land out of production, and there were no net losses of profits, and yields were actually 35% higher in this 8% treatment, which is pretty remarkable. We now are doing something similar in Saskatchewan. We started to ask farmers to work with us and plant perennial forages next to wetlands. On the left is an example. Sorry, this is I don't know, something went wrong here on the slide. But anyways, on the left is the wetland treatments. So this is actual field maps where we had the farmer, we worked with him to try and design where to put these perennial forages. And these ones were all around wetlands. And on the right are examples of field maps where we had the farmer plant perennials in areas that were just saline or marginal. They were low producing areas, maybe with soil fertility problems or with soil salinity problems. In total, both cases, or in all cases, we had them replace between 10 and 20% of their cropland into those forages, and we're now starting to measure the benefits. And we can see that there's been no net loss of profitability in those treatment areas, in the overall field compared to the control fields. And in fact, we're starting to measure higher gains in biodiversity, improvements in soil health and water quality. So this could be a win-win. And in other places in south of the border, this is a study done in Iowa, which has now been going on for 10 years, well, or more. But there was a project to plant strips of prairie forages, as well as some flowering species intermixed with their very common corn soybean rotations. So these are large, expansive fields, look very similar to us on the prairies, but instead they've they planted these strips, long strips with the diverse kind of forages there in between them. Those are permanent perennial forage strips, and they just continue to use row cropping in between. And they tested the various ways to do this. So they've done 100% row crops, so no prairie strips. They've done the 10% of the prairie slope, just putting those strip in right at the foot slope. And they've tried it using more interspersed strips of 10% or 20% of the field in these strips. And remarkably, they found that this 10% was the sweet spot. If they planted them in strips and they converted 10% of the field to these forages, so taking that 10% of the land out of production, they actually saw 2.5-fold increase in insect taxa richness. Pollinators went up by 3.5-fold. Native birds went up 2.5-fold. Soil retention was 20-fold, and phosphorus retention, or that soil fertility, went up over 4-fold. So huge gains in doing this, and really no net loss of profits. So again, there doesn't seem to be any downside to doing this, only the pros. Now, wetlands are kind of our specialty here in the prairies. We've got this diversity already here. Like wetlands are just already making our very homogeneous landscape more heterogeneous. So that adds diversity right there. But of course, we're losing wetlands, right? We're draining them, we're degrading them. These are examples of wetlands that we've been studying. So on the top, this is what we would like to see. This is where farmers have kind of retained the buffer. And then here's where farmers have basically cropped right up to the edge of the wetland and sort of destroyed the buffer. Those buffers, or those vegetative zones, the natural wetland vegetation, are hugely important for maintaining the water quality as well as maintaining biodiversity. We know that intact wetlands, the ones that have the buffer or have an intact vegetative community, actually have lower neonicotinoid concentrations. So here is a spike after a rainfall event. The site that had no buffer had a much higher concentrations in the wetland compared to the site that had an intact vegetative buffer. So these buffers and just preventing cropping right to the margin, right to the edge of the water, are going to produce major gains for reducing pesticide contamination. But they also are great for birds. As it turns out, we've been studying tree swallows, and this little guy is wearing a little GPS unit on his back actually it's a she, this is a female. So this female tree swallow, she nests in their tree swallow box right here. And this little unit can detect every 10 minutes, it takes a GPS reading of where she is. So we put the tag on her. It turns on the next day. She flies around and makes all these trips to and from her nest box, and it records where she was. And then we come back the following day and come and retrieve the tag off of her. And here's what we get. We see that, in fact, all of these tracks are showing the bird foraging over various parts of these farm fields. But what you notice is that a lot of the foraging trips are over water. And in fact, they disproportionately use water, especially as they move further from the box. So you can see this tree swallow went all the way this distance. And where did she end up? The only reason she went this far is to go to this wetland. So we find that when they are traveling further, they're going to water. So water in these agricultural landscapes, even in intensively cropped areas, are going to be hugely important for maintaining biodiversity and maintaining our aerial insectivores that are seeing some serious declines. Now, when we think of, farmers, I'm a child of two parents who were business people, so I'm not the child of a farmer, but I am a child of a family that has run a business for several decades, and I understand profitability because I've been raised in that realm. And I don't think that we should be asking farmers to throw away their profits, nor do I think that they should be throwing away their productivity. The world needs to feed a large number of people. We cannot have yields decrease substantially from reductions in chemical use, for example. But there have been studies done, and this one is in France, looking at a whole suite of different farms, not just, in fact, none of them in this study were organic farms. They were all conventional farms. They used almost 1,000 farms, and you can see them by all these dots. And the dots are color coded based on whether or not the producer was gaining or losing profit in these based on their chemical use. And as it turns out, 94% of the farms reported no loss in productivity. Those are the green and yellow dots. And 77% of the farms reported no loss in profitability when they used or reduced their pesticides. So just reducing their pesticide use seems to, at least on the majority of farms, cause no loss of productivity or profitability. There's really, in fact, the study concluded that 42% of all farms in France could actually reduce their chemical use without any negative effects on productivity or profitability. So it's pretty remarkable that we're just really overusing chemicals in the first place. And in fact, if we use less, we'd save money. Farmers would save money, but they'd also do the environment a big favor. And then lastly, I think what's really key is that we just need to diversify. So I said we could diversify using those wetlands or using grassy margins and forages, but there's other ways that farmers can do it. And there's endless opportunities, and farmers are fantastic experimenters. So we could move away from just sort of monocrops to planting diverse crops, things like intercrops, cover crops, having longer rotations. So instead of just rotating our canola and wheat, we can actually rotate with more diverse crops. These are sort of practices that are well established, well known, but aren't really being used. Similarly, crop livestock integration, so bringing livestock into these crop production systems, can actually have huge benefits for soil health. And this is starting to catch on a little bit now in the prairies. Of course, most of this kind of regenerative type agriculture and practices have not been well studied in terms of biodiversity. There's just new research starting to emerge on what the impacts are for birds and other insects, for example. But it's an exciting area of research that I'm hoping to get to start working on. So I'll just finish by saying that if we kind of reframe this concept of agricultural sustainability and move away from just simply looking at yields, we actually can start to rebalance the triangle and think of these as co-benefits. So environment can actually have co-benefits for food security. Environment can have co-benefits for the producer, right? If he's thinking about both of these things, he can actually make more money. And similarly, there can be co-benefits between that, of course, making more money coming from your yields being stable. And so overall, we have to think of this, in an integrated way and look for those win-wins. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here. And I'm excited to sort of continue studying some of these solutions. All right, thank you so much for listening. I put my email up there in case anybody wants to reach out and get in touch with me later after the talk, but I think we have a few minutes, 10 minutes or so for questions if people want to ask them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christy. That was a wonderful presentation. If everyone wants to put a little clapping in there, I think you could use the reactions there. A wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, you're welcome to type it out in the chat there for us, and I can read it off to Dr. Christie Morrissey. I do have a question myself, and I am interested to hear in what ways is this research being communicated to the farming community?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, the first first thing I always say is farmers, not many that I know, are reading journal papers like my publications, right? So that is not how they're getting the information, and I'm keenly aware of that. And because I probably wouldn't read my publications either. So my strategy is, well, one, I do go to sort of some of the, meetings, like bigger meetings, like for the canola groups or for, producer group meetings, and I get invited to speak there, which is great. But actually, I think the best way to get this information out is to do the kind of research that we're starting to do now, which is called like a participatory research, where you have the producer involved or engaged in the actual research themselves. So the project that we're working on is having producers convert areas of farmland that are unproductive. So they're selecting these areas. We're telling them about why they should be doing this, and we're sharing the results like in real time. Every year we're giving them the results. Here's what we found. And they're sharing the results with us too, about their yields, about their chemical use, about their profits, and I think that's a more effective way to share it, because that producer's then gonna, and this is already starting to happen, but he's sharing it with his neighbor. His neighbor's going to be like looking over the fence. What are you doing? What are those weird grass plots you have growing? And you're like, why are you doing that? And this kind of just can grow this kind of network. So I think it has huge potential.
Fantastic, thank you. So D. Lewis asks, what analysis was used to detect the chemicals in the aquatic insects?
Yeah, we use, okay, so most of our research on the actual measurements of insecticides or pesticides are done in water. That's the simplest matrix, and we use an extraction technique, and then we analyze them depending on the compound. We run them on a mass spectrometer, and if it's certain compounds, we use liquid chromatography, and others we use gas chromatography. But essentially, we're extracting the chemical out of the water. Sometimes we do this in sediment. We also do it now in insects, and we do it in bird blood as well. So we have more techniques available to us now to analyze more different types of samples, but they basically follow the same principle of extracting the chemical and removing sort of the impurities, and then concentrating it, and then analyzing it on those instruments that allow you to identify peaks where the identified compound is known relative to a standard.
Thank you. Ina asks, what is the chance of getting neonics banned again, and how do we pursue that?
Well, if I knew that answer. Okay, how do we get neonics banned? What I'm working on right now, is funny you should ask that, is so when the decision came out in May last year, of course, many of us were a little dismayed by that, and I read the report, and it's really long, and it's technical, and most people wouldn't understand it, but I understood it, and I understood many of the flaws that were in it. And I also saw all over the report that there was a considerable amount of industry interference in the review process that was quite glaring. So I did file a notice of objection. You only have 60 days to file your notice of objection following a decision. And one of the things when you file a notice of objection, it has to be based on science. And so there's relatively few people who will do this, but I did file one. And importantly, one of the things that I needed in order to prove my case is I needed the data, the actual raw data that they were using, so that I could prove that there was some, fudging, let's say, or interpretation that was not accurate, because it's not consistent with the scientific literature. They also had removed a number of our studies, citing that there was no location data for wetlands that were used. So we didn't publish the farmers' fields, and they reckoned that was a reason to remove them. So I'm now reviewing, I finally got the data some 9 months later. It just arrived in the mail on a stick. It's all highly secure, and I Can't copy it, print it, search it, do nothing. It's 143 files with thousands of pages in each. So it's pretty cryptic to go through, but I'm finding all kinds of nuggets in there, and I'm preparing a notice of objection, which I have, I'm allowed to have this access to the data for 30 days. So it took PMRA 9 years, and they're giving me 30 days. Yeah, so just to illustrate why this process is flawed, that's one of the reasons it's flawed. And but I am working on it, so I'll let you know.
Wow, that sounds like intense data sets there.
Yeah. It's very interesting, let's just say.
Wow. Linda says, thanks. In the 3 examples where land margins were planted with perennials, UK, Saskatchewan, Iowa, were the main crops grains or other insect pollinated crops?
A bit of both. It's both. So grains, but also rapeseed or canola, and are common in all of those environments. And then the one in Iowa was corn and soybeans. So neither are really, I mean, corn is more wind pollinated to my understanding. So those aren't typically, insect pollinated, but there was, they've shown that one of the reasons why, and this has actually been shown now in Alberta as well, that canola, that is in association with kind of these green areas, right? Areas that are uncultivated, actually does better. And it's largely to do with the beneficial predatory insects. So pollinators are part of the story, but the predatory insects are really important, and they can control pest populations, in many cases better than insecticides, as long as your insecticides don't kill the predatory insects, right? So that's partly why you have to use your insecticides or your chemicals really judiciously, to protect those other species of insects that are hugely important.
Thank you. Elizabeth Boobin asks, how can we support you in your objection against PMRA decision? Sorry, it's Bobin. I think, sorry, I said that wrong.
I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. I can't even share this information. I can't even copy it. I mean, I'm literally handwriting off of what I see off the screen, and they give me thousands of files. So I can't even share it to have someone else help me with it. But I would say you could write to them, to the minister, and express your dismay. I mean, I think it's never too late for that, right? And I think more broadly, I think they're thinking now, PMRA is trying to undergo a transformation. We put a lot of pressure on them. They know I'm submitting this, so they know they're under the wire. There's pressure to transform, and they're undergoing a transformation process to make things more transparent to the public, how they come to decisions. And they're also bringing in a scientific advisory committee that would be at arm's length from them. So that's one new proposed change. And they're also bringing in a water monitoring program for Canada. So these are new initiatives that are being brought out, largely stemming out of the neonicotinoid controversy. They've been a long time coming, but they have really been pushed to the forefront because there's so much pushback on how that really went wrong. I think the neonics are just a poster child for all the problems that our PMRA is facing, right? They have tens of thousands of chemicals that they need to review, and they have to review them every 15 years. So it's just an enormous task, and there's been a general sentiment to just sort of push these chemicals through. Not a lot of pushback, up until recently. And of course, the lobbying by industry is very, very high. They're lobbying all the time, and they did manipulate that decision. They went out and collected 4 years of new water data and used techniques to refute the published data that we were providing them. So they went out and collected 4 years of data from selected areas, found that they were clean remarkably, that they, wow, amazing. And then sort of flooded the data set with their own water data. Well, of course, that's, to anybody who knows anything, that's not how you do it. And yet this is how the system got corrupted. So I think it's important that, there's some reform of the system, and we're working on it. So I hope so. But thanks, Elizabeth. I'm really appreciative.
Wonderful, thank you. And Rosemary asks, is the federal government reviewing Roundup again
Yes.
related to impacts on humans?
Yes. Yeah, there was a notice of objection for increase. If some of you might know this, but there was a notice of objection filed after the decision to increase the regulatory limit for glyphosate on food products. So glyphosate is used not only as a herbicide to control weeds. Glyphosate is used as a desiccant. It's sprayed on the crop at the end, like at harvest, to desiccate the crop and make it harvestable quicker. As a result, what was happening was the residues on the food product were not meeting regulatory limits, like safe limits for human health. And so industry's response to that was to lobby PMRA to increase the limit, not to tell the growers to stop using it right before harvesting, but rather to increase the limit so now that it would be safe. And they did, in fact, PMRA made a decision to increase the limit. Well, they got huge pushback. And so there was a notice of objection, and that is being reviewed, and currently that has been suspended. That decision to increase the limit has been suspended as a result. So it can't, yeah, you gotta be watching for all this, right? But there are some people who are watching pretty carefully. There's a lot more suspicion now, and so these things aren't as easily pushing through.
Karen Gray asks, are studies being done on the soil health also?
Yeah, there definitely is. Soils harbor a whole suite of organisms, right, that are hugely beneficial to fertility of the soils and to the crops. So there's quite a bit of research, not at my university or not here, but certainly globally, there's quite a bit of research on the impacts of these on neonics and other chemicals to soils and soil organisms. And things like fungicides are actually really problematic for microorganisms. So many of you have heard of the microbiome and how this is really important for your gut health. Well, soils have like a microbiome, and when you start treating them with all kinds of chemicals that are, that kill the microbiome, that kill those beneficial bacteria, you actually are, and mycorrhizae and other fungal, good funguses, those are going to result in lower fertility. And so there's really interesting research on that coming out that's showing it's actually more damaging to your yields, which requires then greater inputs of fertilizers to compensate. So if we just removed a lot of the fertilizer, removed a lot of the chemicals, we actually could, the system would balance itself better. But we've kind of lost that plot. So I think that's some new work that's really exciting.
Wonderful, thank you. So Cheryl asks, have eco buffers been considered in addition to the strips of perennials? Eco buffers are an agroforestry design concept.
Yeah, agroforestry is hugely beneficial. That's sort of part of this. The concept is something like described as farm planning. So you can kind of design the farm with, you know, various shelter belts and hedgerows and other, now there's really cool research on, what is it, haskap, that berry, that's got all these cool, you know, amazing carbon capture benefits, but also, of course, biodiversity benefits because it's a berry, and that's forage for wildlife, and has commercial benefits because it's, you know, humans will consume it as well. So there's actually some really neat work on planting these diverse kind of shrubs as well as trees that are really exciting. So remember the old shelter belt program in the prairies, and that sort of disappeared, right? Like nobody, like that just went by the wayside. But there's a renewed interest from the federal government to plant, to fund basically any group that wants to plant trees in the prairies. And so if you're interested in that, it's under this Nature Climate Solutions Fund, and any small NGO or others can apply for that, and you could be planting trees as well as you know, some of these other diverse shrubs, which are really neat. So maybe that could be a project for your group to look into.
Thank you. So just a couple more questions. We've got lots of great interest and conversation going on here, which is amazing. Thank you for fielding all these questions.
Sure,
I'll give you a couple
happy
more
to.
here.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Myrna asks, are there groups that the public can join to help with the work your group and others are doing?
Well, I am aware that there's a few like NGO groups that work on some of these chemical issues, like some that come to mind, like Eco Justice. There's some, you know, David Suzuki Foundation. There's several environmental groups that are very active in this space of watching the chemical regulations that come out, as well as, you know, basically fundraising for legal fees to pursue some of the court actions that are often required, right? Like, I mean, many of these things get settled in ways that do require money, but most of these organizations are relying on, you know, they're NGOs, but they are fundraising for those kind of activities. So I think there's some really good people who are working on these topics, and they do come to me, for example, for advice from time to time. So I don't testify or anything in courts or whatever, but sometimes they just trying to get sort of opinions or advice or whatever, and so they're often looking for that kind of expertise. But it's nice to see that there is activity. But there's also, you know, I think Nature Alberta and Nature Saskatchewan and others and other naturalist groups can really do a lot to, one, connect to farmers and be liaison to network to producers, to apply for money. There's lots of various small pots of money that groups like yourselves could be getting to do some of these sort of works, like, you know, like pollinator plantations, so planting diverse perennials and in various areas, working in cities as well as in some of the agricultural areas, restoring lands, as well as connecting with groups like Ducks Unlimited, or I'm thinking of Alice Canada. They have established programs that actually have farmers who will convert various lands. And I know there's some new exciting groups that are working with schools as well. So I'm thinking of One School, One Farm is another group that has been connecting farmers, like a farm family, with a school class or a school group, and having the kids come out and plant, say, those pollinator friendly areas on a farm. And so they're learning about farming at the same time as, you know, sort of learning about the environment as well, which is really nice to see.
Sounds like a wonderful program.
Yeah.
Something along the lines that Nature Alberta has been involved in before, with planting trees in different areas and throwing, we called them bee bombs.
Oh, yeah.
Little clumps of dirt with wildflower seeds in them to get them planted. A great way to increase knowledge with kids and families and getting them involved there as well. So Elizabeth also added in the chat a couple other groups that
Safe
you
Food
can
Matters,
connect
yeah.
with. Tony asks, are neonic seed treatments the only effective control for flea beetles?
No, there are, so some of the newer chemicals that I just mentioned in the talk were those diamide insecticides. So most of the replacement chemicals work on the same principle. They're systemic seed treatments. They have the same chemical properties, just a different name. They are a different class of chemicals, but they're working on the same principle and have a lot of the same environmental problems. In terms of environmentally friendly options for flea beetle, like non-chemical, the most exciting ones that I've seen are, well, two things I'll say. One is intercropping. So planting 2 or more different crops together, like pea and canola, is hugely beneficial. You can reduce your chemical use by half in those systems, and they're seeing yields that are like 130% or more of when they grow them separately. So growing crops together is really important, really kind of like gaining some steam, and is a hugely beneficial way to reduce the chemical reliance, because basically the pest is confused, right? So instead of giving it a buffet of all the same thing, now you're interfering with it by planting crops that are not right, 2 or more crops together. The other one that's really exciting is a variety of canola that's called it's called hairy canola, and it's been developed already by Ag Canada, I believe, and it's basically kind of like furry on its stems, and so the flea beetle cannot bite or suck the stem. And so it's a genetically modified variety of canola that is essentially naturally resistant to flea beetle because of its physical properties. So it has been developed but not marketed. And of course, the reason it's not marketed, and at least from my investigations, is just because, who's going to want to market it, right? Like, because there's more money in the seed varieties made that are, so most people don't realize this, but the seed companies are owned by the chemical companies. So all of the seeds are sort of the patent of the seed is owned by the chemical companies. So Bayer and Syngenta and so on, DuPont, et cetera, they all own seed companies. So they're selling them in that combo. So who's gonna sell the untreated hairy canola, right? Like nobody wants that because it's not profitable, right? So this is problematic. You similarly cannot buy untreated canola actually at all. So even any variety, you have to buy it with a treatment on it. And so that's another big issue that people have been raging about for years. Like, why can a farmer not buy an untreated seed? That's hugely problematic. I think they should be able to choose if they want to buy it with or without the seed treatment. And but those are a couple examples. They exist, but they're just not as widely used.
Thank you so much. Just another note here from Ryan. Alberta Conservation Association has programs for farmers to maintain benefits for wildlife, birds, and species at risk. So that is fantastic. So I think that we've probably taken up enough of your time today. I have posted your email address in the chat for anyone who has further questions or wants to connect. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it over to Harvey. Harvey, I'll get you to unmute and let's all give a round of applause again and a huge thank you.
Yes, well, again, Christy, if this was Christy 2, I think we might have to have a Christy 3, I mean, Rambo had a whole bunch of these, right?
Oh, wow.
And they didn't rate with your quality. So I don't know whether I'll be around when you're here 7 years from now, but I'm sure there'll be somebody want to step up to do it. And it's really been quite glorious. It's wonderful. I see a number of friends and science friends in the audience and other really famous people in terms of everything from nature photography to you name it. And I see colleagues of yours who've labored away doing the science here in Alberta, we'll say with the oil patch. And as they say, they don't get no respect. In fact, they get blacklisted and they don't get contracts and they don't even get at universities. So I'm delighted that we have people like you and many others at universities doing the work, telling the truth, finding the facts. And as I said, the last time you were here, I think the University of Saskatchewan, that I'm glad to see there's still people there who are working in the interest of the planet and the farmers. My wife and I both have ancestors who moved there in the early 1900s, and her uncle in particular used to go over to see the scientists at the university. I mean, if he wanted to change, Fife wheat or something, he'd go there to get some help. That's where the research was done. And I'm glad to see that you're there, and I'm sure there are lots of other people doing this, but you're there speaking the truth. You're not, against farmers and farmers having a good livelihood and doing better, but I'm delighted you're there. So on behalf of Crooked Creek and myself, and I think everyone, thank you very much. We hope to see you again.
Yeah, really appreciate it, Harvey. Much appreciated. And yes, I'm definitely pro-farmer. For the record. I'm not pro-chemical industry, but I am pro-farmer. So yeah, excellent.
And again, thank you to Nature Alberta and Stephanie and Rick and the new president, who I don't know. I understand she's with the Alberta Plant Council. I see Elizabeth Beaubien here, and she goes way back in the Plant Council. Good to see some friends like that here from the last time and from way back when I was, the Natural History Club in the city there and so on. I couldn't hold a candle to people like most of these people here as naturalists, but they're here. Thank you, and thanks again, Nature Alberta.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and for everybody who came. You had a great. I think I saw over 60 people there, so that's really great. So I appreciate very much the invitation and chance to speak. One of the good things about Zoom, the pandemic and Zoom, is that we now can reach a wider audience. So that's fantastic.
Yep.
And all during a blizzard as well. So
yeah, right. Like wonderful. Who would be able to get out? That's true. Exactly. No, exactly. Yeah.
Wonderful. So there's lots of notes of thanks in the chat there for you as well, Christy. Thank you again so much. And thanks again for everyone joining us. Check out the next, there's so many presentations happening through all of our member clubs over the next couple of weeks. And then we're also having Wes Olson come and speak with us about flying bison in April. So make sure you check out Nature Alberta's events page, naturealberta.ca/events, to keep connected over Zoom. So wonderful. I hope everyone has a wonderful night, and I think I will end it at that. So thank you so much.